Hello, my name is David Marler from Rotterdam UAS, and this is Lecture 3 for the course Culture and Literature 2, British Culture and Literature. And today we're going to be talking about British history up to 1458. And the title of this week's web lecture is Four British Invasions. The goal for this lecture is that you can describe the four major invasions of the of Great Britain and the British Island, namely the Roman, Anglo-Saxon, Viking, and Norman invasions, and the effect that these invasions had on the island and the forming of British culture, religion, language, government, and identity. You'll also know details about important historic events and key people from this time period. Now, as you would with every week, you want to have a look at the key terms in the syllabus. And at the end, you're going to check the ones that we have not covered in this web lecture, because those you have to study for the exam. Now, to begin with, let's go back 10,000 years, and we're going to look at someone that we now call Cheddar Man. And Cheddar Man is actually a very interesting find. It's an archaeological find where they were able to select DNA from the skeleton of this man outside of Cheddar, who lived in Britain about 10,000 years ago. And archaeologists, anthropologists, and biologists were able to come together and make a reconstruction of this man's face. Now, the first people who lived in Britain, we can say, entered the island around 10,000 years ago, and they had dark to black skin. A groundbreaking DNA analysis of Britain's oldest complete skeleton has revealed this. This fossil, as I said, known as Cheddar Man, was unearthed more than a century ago in Gow's Cave in Somerset. Intense speculation is built up around Cheddar Man's origins and appearance because he lived shortly after the first settlers crossed from continental Europe to Britain at the end of the last Ice Age. People of white British ancestry alive today are descendants of this population to a certain extent. We'll talk about that in a bit. Many questions remain how these people were eventually able to get lighter skin like they do now. We do know, however, that these people are relatives of the modern people in Britain. And we can see this, for instance, in the blue eyes. And we, of course, know that skin tone for all human beings is actually, we see it as a construct of being white, black, brown. But in reality, we're all essentially have the same skin, just different levels of melanin. Now, we then get into our next group of people, and these are in the late Neolithic or the early Bronze Age, and we call these people beaker folk because these people were living about 4,500 years ago in the temperate zones of Europe, and they got the name of their culture from these distinctive bell-shaped beakers that were decorated with finely toothed stamps, and we can see them. And because they made these beakers, we call them the beaker people. And so almost everyone in Europe, but also in starting from Central Asia, we can see that that this was a normal type of pottery. And at the time, we didn't actually have names for the groups of people in Europe. Because they didn't have a name for themselves. You don't have writings of them. So we call this, from 4,500 years ago, these people the beaker people. All of the information that we have about these peoples are based upon the information we have from archaeology, and that's how they got their name. So around 2,000 years ago, there was an Iron Age Celtic culture throughout the northwest plains of Europe, and this went all the way from Central Europe all the way into Great Britain. So north of the, let's say, what were today the Etruscans or the Romans once lived, and now Italy, all the way up until Britain, we had Celtic cultures. So including in the Netherlands, including in most of Germany and France, you had Celts. Stonehenge is considered to be one of the most important buildings or structures ever built by the Celts. And it was built between 5,000 and 4,300 years ago on Salisbury Plain. Now, there are many mysteries about Stonehenge, and many archaeologists speculate on what its function was. It appears to have functioned as a type of astronomical clock, and we can see this because the sun lights up in a specific way. And it was used by a group of people that we called the Druids, which were Celtic priests. Now, online, you're going to see another video that you're going to watch specifically about Stonehenge and what its role was, and also about Druid culture. Now, a lot of what we know about the Celts and a lot of what we know about the way that ancient Britons and their culture was through writings that we got generally from foreigners. And this is going to be the case also about Anglo-Saxon culture to a certain extent. And that's because starting in the year 43 to 410, we have a period called the Roman period. Now, this is a significant chunk of time when we consider it. I mean, we're talking about more than 350 years. It's around 350 years, sorry. So it's a large chunk of time that we're dealing with. Now, the Romans began their conquest of Britain in 43 AD under Emperor Claudius, and the Roman province of Britannia covered of what today we would consider to be mostly in England and in Wales. And we can see here that it was part of a larger British Empire that went all the way from Egypt to Israel, including most of what is today Turkey, all of northern Africa, even parts of the Netherlands. So at one time, these were all under one we can't really call it a state because it doesn't exist like the nation states of today, but definitely under one authority. Now, the Romans were known for their way of keeping power over their subjects. The soldiers that they used came primarily from what we would today call France, Spain, and Italy. These were the soldiers that were used to conquer Britain. The Romans are known for their strange way of keeping control over the local populations, and it may be a reason why so few of the Romans were left behind. The Romans worked with a system called client states. They were native tribes who chose to align themselves with the Roman Empire because they saw it as the best option for self-preservation and for the protection from other hostile tribes. So when Rome said that they actually had control over the Britons, they did. They had forts there, they had possibly a few legions, but the real way that they actually gained control was that they would go in and they would create a client state. So the king of the Britons or the Picts or any of the local Celtic tribes would then swear allegiance and pay a tribute or a tax to the Roman Empire. And relatively, the Romans didn't deal a lot with the runnings of local society. Now, one of the relics that we can see of the Roman Empire is Hadrian's Wall, which was a defensive fortification in the Roman province of Britannia, begun in AD 122 in the region of the reign of the Emperor Hadrian. It ran from the banks of the River Tyne near the North Sea to Solway Firth on the Irish Sea, and was the northern limit of the Roman Empire, immediately north of which were the lands of the ancient Britons, including the Picts. Now, according to Hadrian, its main function was to mark the northernmost border of the British Empire and also to separate the civilized from the barbarian. Can you see any of this in popular English culture? Think about certain films or popular series in which a gigantic wall is built across the entire north to separate barbarians from civilized people. Now, the first question that you're going to look at is, what were the relics of Roman rule? You can look in your book, and I also want you to look at, for instance, aspects like the names of cities, other buildings, pieces of art, etc. Now, the next invasion or set of invasions that we're going to look at are the Germanic invasions, which began between 410 and 1066 and actually include the invasions of two different groups of people. Now, the first one that we're going to talk about is the invasion of the Anglo-Saxons. Now, the Roman occupation had primarily been an occupation of colonial control. This meant that the Romans were not necessarily interested in moving to Britain. This was mainly because the Romans made their money through tributes, and that meant that the Celts were in control most of the time. The real invasion began in 410, and it was a Germanic invasion that happened as the Romans were leaving Britain. It is important to remember that the Celts at the time of the Anglo-Saxon invasion were Christians. For a long time, many believed that Anglo-Saxons had no contact with Britain during the Roman occupation. We now know that this is untrue. There is a lot of evidence that there was a lot of contact between the Anglo-Saxon tribes and Roman Britain. The term that we use for these people that came from what is today Denmark, Germany, and the Netherlands is Anglo-Saxon. But in reality, they came from tribes that were called the Angles, which we can see in what is today Denmark and northern Germany. The Jutes, which are from the peninsula of Jutland in northern Denmark. The Saxons, which are from northern Germany, and the Frisians, which are from northern Germany and the Netherlands. It is important to remember that English is a distant cousin of Frisian. At the invasion of the Anglo-Saxons was halted by the legendary Roman king, King Arthur. By the end of the 6th century, the Romans were completely gone, and the Anglo-Saxons were able to settle most of what is today called England. Celtic culture was almost completely decimated. And we can see this because of the lack of Celtic words in English. So anytime that we look at two cultures that are mixing, we can see through the language and how far these cultures actually mix. So we can also see that, for instance, Native American and First Nation words in North American English there are very few of them. So we can see that this was an invasion in which there was very little assimilation. So Celtic words in English are, for instance, crag, corrie, brock, bog, crumpet, whiskey. And it's important to note that a lot of these words actually came into English much later, and they came through Irish. So they came through Irish people who spoke English, who would then use a specific Celtic word from Gaelic in English as a type of code switching. So it's important to remember or think about why this happened, because if we actually look at Celtic words, which were native to Britain, and English and Dutch cognate, so words in English and Dutch that look almost exactly the same, then we can see that there's a much closer link to Dutch and German than there is to, for instance, Celtic. Now, the Anglo-Saxons, when they moved to Britain, they had very little use for the Roman cities that were left behind. And a lot of these cities became essentially, they were abandoned to a certain extent. That's because the Anglo-Saxons were primarily farmers. In reality, they revolutionized the way that farming was done on the British Isles. They set up farming communities, and they were good tenants of the land. And the Anglo-Saxons created several smaller kingdoms, so there was no such thing as England. It was not until much later that there was talk of a united country under Alfred. This is often referred to as the Heptarchy, and it was set up into 7 different countries. First, we have Kent, which was settled by the Jutes. Then we have Mercia, whose best-known ruler, Offa, built Offa's Dyke along the border between Wales and England. We then have Northumbria, which is where the monk Bede came from, and who is considered to be one of the biggest historians of Anglo-Saxon Britain. He wrote the ecclesiastical history of Britain. We have East Anglia, which was settled by the Angles. The North Folk, which is where we now get the term Norfolk, and South Folk, where we get the term Suffolk. We have Essex, which was settled by the East Saxons. We have Sussex, which was settled by the South Saxons, and Wessex, which was settled by the West Saxons. What we have from the Anglo-Saxons today is the way that we speak. A lot of the words that we have in English are Anglo-Saxon words. The second group that entered were the Vikings. And we can see the Viking rule because the Vikings were doing a lot of traveling around this time. If we look at this map right here, we can see that by the 8th century, another Germanic invasion is starting to begin. And this time, the invasion came from the Vikings. Between the 8th and 11th century, the Vikings began to become a sort of plague on Europe, and especially northern Africa and Western Europe. Viking raids became normal, and they even start settling large groups of new colonies. One of them is in the north of England and Ireland, but also in Normandy, Tunisia, Sicily, and Eastern Europe. Viking invasions become normal. And we can see this throughout all of Europe. For instance, one of the theories about the name of the word Russia was the fact that the Vikings would come on boats through Russia and into Iran and the Middle East, and that the word for Russia is actually comes from a Persian word for people that traveled on boats. So we could see that the Vikings definitely left their stamp. Now, the major compromise that happened was that the Vikings are entering in and they're displacing the Anglo-Saxons. So the Anglo-Saxons are not raiders. The Anglo-Saxons are no longer nomadic, meaning that they travel. The Anglo-Saxons have now set up a farming community, and they're good farmers. And that's because England has good farmland. The Vikings then realize that there are large fields in England that are great for farming, that don't have to be cleared from forests. And the Vikings say, we're going to send large amounts of farmers there. This then causes a huge issue because the Anglo-Saxons are already living there. Now, the Anglo-Saxons and the Vikings are both Germanic peoples. Their languages aren't that different, and there would have been a lot of contact between the two. Now, eventually, a compromise was made, and this major compromise is called the Dane Law, issued by Alfred the Great. Alfred was able to stop the Vikings by allowing them to possess a part of Britain, and we can see this as the red part above. The Dane Law was recorded in the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle. It's a historical name given to the part of England in which the laws of the Danes held sway and dominated those of the Anglo-Saxons. Dane law contrasts with West Saxon law and Mercian law. The term is first recorded in the 11th century as Danelaga. And actually, it's funny because the word law comes from the Scandinavians, from the Danes. And we see a lot of words that come from Norse, so we can see that there is a lot of contact. And we can also see that Danish, or what we would actually call Old Norse, which are the general language that the Vikings spoke, had a really big impact on the English language. A lot of words that start with SK, for instance, sky, skill, and ski, those are all, of course, Norse words, but also law. One of the big, if you go to anywhere in Scandinavia and you see, for instance, in Denmark and Copenhagen, the big courthouse above it has what they consider to be the first sentence ever written in Norwegian or in Old Norse, and that's med lov skal man landes bygge. That means with law, men can build countries. Also words like sail, egg, dirt, call, and take. And we also get a lot of grammar from them. So we start seeing that we move from using cases, and we'll see this also in Middle English, and we start moving towards a very similar system that the northern Germanic tribes used. We also are no longer going to use he for the third person plural. We will start using the Norse words die and das. By the end of the 10th century, we got a political union, and we start seeing a lot of books. For instance, the Classical History of Britain that I mentioned earlier, which gives us a history and insight in the Anglo-Saxon Britain. We also have the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle. We have Beowulf, which won't be discovered for another several centuries, but that was written at that time, and a lot of religious texts. In 927, we get the Kingdom of England under Athelstan. And from 1013 to 1042, we actually have something called the North Sea Empire. And in 1066, we finally have the Norman invasion. And the Norman invasion seems as if it's a French invasion, but in reality, as you're going to read in the article, it's actually an invasion of the Vikings who had settled in France. So your second question is, who was Alfred and why was he considered to be great? Look this up in your book and bring it to the lecture. Now, in 1066, the Normans invaded. And the first question that we have to ask ourselves is who the Normans were. We're going to watch a video really quickly to see who the Normans were. Your third question is read the text in your reader about the Normans. Who were they? What peoples did they descend from? The Normans entered England and conquered it with William the Conqueror in 1066, an important date to remember when they gained control of all of England. Scotland remains under what we would consider to be Norse or Scandinavian control. Now, the most important thing that the Normans brought with them was feudalism. And feudalism is a very, very direct hierarchy. There's no large-scale invasion, no Norman part like there was with the Danes when they invaded Anglo-Saxon lands. And each invading leader was given a title by William the Conqueror, who becomes the king. So, for instance, a baron, a duke, etc., and they were given large pieces of land. The people working on this land, the Anglo-Saxons, were peasants. So the way that the system would work is that William the Conqueror has large amounts of families, generals, important people. They're all given a large piece of land, and this land is then, they're then called, for instance, a baron. They then become the landlord. However, they're not going to farm 50 square miles of land. So what they do is they have peasants that are there, the peasants that are already living there, and all that they say is, I'm going to collect tax. This is how feudalism works. Then, after they collect tax, they then have to, they keep a large part. That's how this baron or this duke lives. And then they give a portion of their tax to the crown, and that's how the crown lives. So this is the important part of feudalism that existed throughout all of Europe. In some places, for instance, in Russia, until the 20th century. Now, the greatest thing that we have from the Norman invasion is called the Domesday Book. And it's one of the most amazing historical artifacts that we can find in this new Norman England. William the Conqueror was very good at collecting information about every single farm and every single person in his kingdom. This was, of course, because he was going to split the kingdom up and give large pieces of land to family and friends. For the coming few hundred years, Norman French remained the language primarily spoken in England, especially among the aristocracy. For first, we also see that there is very strong leadership, something today we refer to as top-down leadership. The Domesday Book allowed us to see each farm, who lived there, and how much of different things they had. So if a farmer farmed grain, we would see the type of grain. If the farmer had 30 sheep, we would see that he had 30 sheep. If he had 10 kids, we would see that. So the Domesday Book was a very great way for us to see exactly how Anglo-Saxon and then later Norman society was established. After 1066, we get something that's called Middle English. Middle English eventually becomes the language spoken by everyone. But it's not until Henry IV that we start seeing Middle English being spoken by the aristocracy. Henry IV, who did speak French, was the first king to address Parliament in English on 13 October 1399. Now, Middle English is still Anglo-Saxon in grammar and base vocabulary, but we get a lot of new words. Anglo-Saxon common law remains the law of the land. So when we look here, we could see that these words that are in red, these are words that come from French, so words like eventually, language, Henry, address Parliament, grammar, vocabulary. Most of the other words that are up there are actually Germanic words. Now, it's also important to look really quickly at Scotland because Scotland had a different history from England. It isn't until 1707 that we're going to get the Union of the Crowns where these two countries come together. In Scotland, things remained the same for a really long time. Scotland remains an independent country under the rule of a mixture of Celtic and Viking kings. That being said, the way that the Romans ruled England was very attractive to the kings of Scotland. The Normans were able to consolidate large parts of power and total control over the body politic. It became normal for Scottish kings to adopt rules of court and rules of law from their counterparts in England. Scotland also became a refuge for many Anglo-Saxon aristocrats who had fled there after the Norman invasion. By the end of the Middle Ages, around 1450, there are two cultural regions within Scotland. The Highlands, which still consisted of Gaelic culture and language, and the Lowlands, which resembled England both socially and linguistically. Now, finally, I'm going to talk about your extra credit assignment, which is due, of course, you can see here it says the 9th of March 2020, but in reality, it's due before next Monday. And that is that you have to write a 250-word short answer essay explaining how the Norman invasion was different from the Germanic invasions, the Anglo-Saxons and the Danes. Use information from your book and this week's article to research this question. Make sure you use APA citation and APA rules, and this is due before next Monday. Thank you for attending this lecture, and have a good day.